on Nobb's Barrow. The strange events in Bewley continue to unravel. Thomasina must now convince Mr Briden to allow her to excavate the Barrow. She's more determined than ever, especially after discovering that her father attempted to excavate the very same site 25 years ago. Inside the Barrow may lie the answers to what happened to him, and possibly a way to save his life. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe for more ASMR gaming content. You can also support me on Ko-fi. The link to my page is in the description. Mr. Shoulder starts by apologizing for his absence. He explains that he has been bedridden with a terrible fever for the past few days. That explains why he didn't answer the door when Thomasina knocked yesterday. But it doesn't explain why he was spotted in the alley behind the inn. Strange. As they talk, Mr. Shoulder seems genuinely surprised to learn that Thomasina's father was involved in the attempt to excavate Ops Barrow 25 years ago. He claims to have no knowledge of the journal Thomasina found earlier that morning either. His interest in excavating Ops Barrow comes from the old folklore surrounding it, as well as the mystery of the failed expedition. Mr. Shoulder shares the tale of how 25 years ago Bewley was in the grip of a terrible crisis. The harvests had failed, and the earn woods were plagued by a strange blight, berries rotting as soon as they grew. Livestock were dying, and the villagers grew desperate. Fear and panic began to spread. Many blamed Ops Barrow for their misfortune. Local legends told of a goblin named Saxnot, who was said to dwell within the Barrow, and many believed that the Barrow was a thin place, where the divide between the physical world and the spirit world was dangerously thin. Saxnot was thought to be the guardian of this place, but a rumor took hold that Saxnot had grown displeased with the villagers and had cursed the land. The villagers became convinced that driving the goblin away would lift the curse and save Bewley. Whatever the expedition found in the Barrow seemed to have worked, for soon after, the harvests thrived, the blight vanished, and the livestock recovered. Thomasina, as expected, dismisses the story as nothing more than foolish superstition. She can't believe her father, a man of reason, would have participated in an expedition to rid a village of a goblin curse. Yet, despite herself, Thomasina can't shake a growing sense of unease. She's been invited, seemingly at random, to a remote village for an excavation. Then she discovers that her father had been here 25 years earlier for the very same reason. Can that really be just a coincidence, as Mr. Shoulder suggests? And what about her dream, the creature that promised to help her father? Could she have dreamt of Saxnot, the goblin of local legend, before she had even heard the story? Another coincidence? It's too much to ignore. Slowly, she begins to entertain more irrational explanations. Though she doesn't yet want to admitted. After her fascinating conversation with Mr. Shoulder, Thomasina heads straight to Mr. Briden's farm, determined to secure his permission to excavate the Barrow. She finds him outside, as resolute as ever, refusing to allow the excavation to proceed. No matter what argument she presents, Mr. Briden remains unmoved. That is, until she shows him the stone that came with her father's journal. Upon seeing it, Mr. Briden goes pale. He hurries into his house and returns a few minutes later, holding another stone, this one carved with two serpents and a different set of letters. It was brought back by his brother, Samuel, from inside the Barrow. Another coincidence? Mr. Briden doesn't think so. At last, he agrees to grant Thomasina permission to excavate the Barrow, but on one condition. He is convinced that something terrible is buried within. Something that drove his brother mad and left Thomasina's father bedridden for the past 25 years. He demands that, at the very first sign of trouble, Thomasina will abandon the excavation, leave immediately, and seal up the Barrow for good. Thomasina, elated at having finally won the permission, agrees without hesitation. The dig can begin tomorrow, or so she hopes. She still needs to find able workers to help with the excavation, strong hands to do the heavy lifting. But where will she find them? It's been an eventful morning for Thomasina. As she returns to the village square, she notices that the market stalls are now fully set up, and the vendors are milling about. Among the crowd, she spots a woman dressed in a maid's uniform. Perhaps she works for Lord Panswyck, Thomasina thinks. Maybe he can lend me some of his workers. Knowing that Lord Panswyck isn't fond of visitors knocking on his door uninvited, Thomasina decides to approach the maid instead. The woman introduces herself as Miss Tompkins, a housemaid in the employ of Lord Panswyck. She's in the village to collect milk from Mr. Ambrose, but he is nowhere to be found. Sensing an opportunity, Thomasina offers to fetch the milk in exchange for an introduction to Lord Panswyck. Miss Tompkins is hesitant at first, but eventually agrees, if only to avoid the wrath of the housekeeper, Miss Fenchurch, for returning empty-handed. Now, where can Thomasina find some milk? The answer lies with Mr. Briden, of course. She remembers seeing a goat at his farm earlier, likely providing fresh milk every morning. With that in mind, she heads back to Mr. Briden and asks if she can milk the goat herself. Mr. Briden agrees, but warns her that his goat is notoriously grumpy. It doesn't like strangers. And sure enough, the goat proves too unruly for Thomasina to handle. In the end, Mr. Briden has to do the milking, but first he needs a remedy for his aching joints from Mother Mildred. Thomasina, eager to keep things moving, agrees to fetch the remedy for him. Thanks to the concoction, Mr. Briden is finally able to milk the goat, and Thomasina can now deliver the milk to Miss Tompkins. Miss Tompkins breathes a sigh of relief as she sees Thomasina approaching with the fresh milk in hand. For For now, it seems she won't be scolded by Miss Fenchurch, at least not today. Together they make their way to Panswyck Manor, with Thomasina filled with anticipation at finally meeting Lord Panswyck. But upon their arrival, things do not go as smoothly as she hoped. Miss Fenchurch is immediately displeased, both with the fact that Miss Tompkins brought goat's milk instead of the usual cow's milk, and with the presence of a stranger on the estate. Her irritation is palpable, and she refuses all of Thomasina's attempts to secure an audience with his lordship, even going as far as to threaten her with being shot if she doesn't leave the property at once. Fortunately, the tension quickly dissolves when Lord Panswyck himself appears, and to Thomasina's surprise, she recognizes him. He is the very gentleman she had met earlier in the day. In hindsight, it seems obvious now, but at the time, Thomasina hadn't pieced it together. Lord Panswyck greets her warmly, eager to know what brings her to his estate. As Thomasina explains her plans to excavate Barrow, his lordship leads her to the chapel he is restoring. He speaks of how his ancestors had turned their backs on God, abandoning the chapel, and now he is determined to restore it, rekindling his family's lost relationship with the divine. According to him, his fortunes have suffered since that connection was severed. But he is certain that by completing this restoration, his name will soon be known throughout all of England. Thomasina finds his talk fascinating, if a bit megalomaniac. Why is he telling me all this, she wonders. And has he forgotten about the St. Edmund's Church? Oh well, as long as he lends me his workers, he can restore whatever he pleases. In the end, Lord Panswyck agrees to lend Thomasina the workers she needs for the excavation. All he asks in return is that she brings him one of Mrs. de Plancy's famous big well puddings. The request is certainly odd, but by now Thomasina is hardly surprised by his lordship's eccentric whims. Unfortunately, this seemingly simple task causes a headache for Thomasina. Mrs. de Plancy has already promised the last of her puddings to Father Roach, and has no intention to bake more. After some persuasion, Thomasina manages to secure one pudding, and quickly returns to Lord Panswyck. Amused by her persistence, his lordship reveals that he never really needed the pudding. He only wanted to test whether she had the tenacity to carry out such a peculiar request. And she did not disappoint. Though mildly irritated by this little game, Thomasina takes solace in the fact that now she has the help she needs for tomorrow's excavation. The sun is beginning to set, and the cold night air settles in. It's time for her to return to the Plough and Furrow Inn. The inn is buzzing with activity tonight. Mr. Tillet is there, Cyril too, and even Mr. Shoulder has made an appearance. But the real surprise is the arrival of Lord Panswyck himself. He buys Thomasina a drink and invites everyone to toast in her honor, wishing her good fortune for tomorrow's excavation. After this unexpected display, Lord Panswyck leaves as swiftly as he came. Though tired, Thomasina isn't quite ready to retire for the night. She notices Mr. Tillett trying to catch her attention from across the room, signaling that he has something important to tell her. He beckons her to follow him into the alley behind the inn, away from prying ears. What Mr. Tillett reveals is troubling, to say the least. The night he disappeared when they first met wasn't because he was drunk and confused. In fact, he remembers it all too clearly now. When he went to the lavatory that evening, he encountered a hooded figure who threatened him, warning him not to speak of what he had seen. At the time, Mr. Tillett had no idea what the figure was referring to, but now his memory is beginning to clear. 2 days before Thomasina arrived in Bewley, he had been sleeping off another drunken night in the Erne woods, when he overheard the voices of 2 men. To his shock, the men were Lord Panswyck and Mr. Shoulder. They were discussing the arrival of a woman in 2 days, and how it was her blood they needed. Lord Panswyck was eager to bring this woman to the site immediately upon her arrival, but Mr. Shoulder insisted they proceeded with caution, that things wouldn't work unless she gave her blood willingly. Thomasina's heart skips a beat. They were talking about her. It wasn't a coincidence that she had been invited to Bewley. She had been lured here. But why? And what danger does she face? Despite the gravity of Mr. Tillett's revelation, Thomasina is resolute. It's too late to turn back now. She must excavate the Barrow, discover what lies within, and uncover the truth about her father. Perhaps now that she knows she's part of a carefully laid scheme, she can find a way to outsmart Lord Panswyck and Mr. Shoulder, or at least play along until the time is right. Or so she thinks. In the next episode, the time to excavate Ops Barrow has finally arrived. As Thomasina ventures deeper and deeper into the burial mound, she uncovers something beyond her wildest imagination. But the consequences of this discovery will be far greater than she ever anticipated.